There are islands on Earth where every step puts you within striking distance of a snake whose venom causes organ failure in hours. Islands where the government weaponized the soil and then walked away for 50 years. Islands so radioactive that 3 of them were literally vaporized off the map. But the most tightly guarded island on this list isn't dangerous at all. It's forbidden because something as small as a seed caught on a bootlace could destroy one of the most important scientific experiments in human history. Today, we're visiting 8 islands you are not allowed to step on, each one forbidden for a completely different reason. If you enjoy this kind of content, subscribe. It really helps. Now let's start with the island most people have heard of, but almost nobody knows the real reason it's banned. 40 kilometers off the coast of São Paulo, Brazil, there's a speck of land called Ilha da Queimada Grande. Most people know it as Snake Island. It covers just 0.43 square kilometers, roughly the size of 40 soccer fields, and it is home to the densest concentration of venomous snakes anywhere on Earth. Estimates suggest up to 1 Golden Lancehead viper per square meter in some zones. That means if you stood still on certain parts of this island, the nearest snake capable of killing you would be closer than the person sitting next to you on a bus. But the snakes aren't the real story. The real story is why they're there, and why their venom is so extraordinarily powerful. Thousands of years ago, rising sea levels cut this island off from the Brazilian mainland. The snakes that were already living there became trapped, along with migratory birds that used the island as a rest stop. Over generations, those birds became the snake's only reliable food source. And here's the problem with hummingbirds. If you bite one and the venom takes too long to work, it flies away and dies somewhere you can't reach it. So natural selection did what it does best. The Golden Lanceheads on Queimada Grande evolved venom estimated to be 3 to 5 times more potent than their mainland cousins, fast-acting enough to kill prey before it can spread its wings. A single bite from one of these snakes can cause massive tissue necrosis, kidney failure, and internal bleeding that can kill a human within hours if left untreated. Brazil's Navy banned all public landings decades ago. The only people allowed on the island are tightly controlled scientific teams accompanied by medical staff on standby with anti-venom. Even they follow strict movement protocols, never stepping where they can't see, never reaching into vegetation, never moving after dark. The Brazilian government treats unauthorized landings as a serious criminal offense, and for good reason. This isn't a place where danger is theoretical. On Snake Island, the danger is coiled under every leaf, waiting with venom designed by evolution to work faster than you can react. You'd think the most forbidden islands are in the middle of nowhere, buried in ocean or hidden behind polar ice. But Poveglia sits just a few miles from St. Mark's Square in Venice, close enough to see from a water taxi. And its history is darker than almost any island on this list. First recorded in 421 AD, Poveglia spent centuries as a small settlement before being repurposed for something far grimmer. Starting in the late 1700s, the island became a quarantine station during Europe's devastating plague outbreaks. Ships arriving in Venice with suspected infections were diverted to Poveglia, where passengers were held in isolation, many of them never leaving. Local lore claims the soil itself is partly composed of ash from tens of thousands of plague corpses burned on the island over the centuries. Whether that's entirely accurate or partly legend, archaeological surveys have confirmed extensive human remains across the site. Then, in 1922, the island became a psychiatric hospital. It operated for over 4 decades before closing in 1968, leaving behind decaying wards, crumbling stairwells, and a bell tower that, according to locals, sometimes rings despite having no bell. The Italian government sealed the island for decades after the hospital closed, not because of ghosts, though the stories certainly helped keep people away. The immediate danger was structural, collapsing roofs, unsafe floors, masonry that could fall without warning. Poveglia was crumbling, and letting the public wander through it was a liability the state wasn't willing to accept. In 2025, a civic group won a 99-year lease to begin converting part of the island into a community park. But access remains tightly controlled, and most of the structures are still off limits. Poveglia sits in one of the most visited cities on Earth, surrounded by tourists sipping espresso and riding gondolas. And yet it remains a place. Almost no one is allowed to go. Poveglia was abandoned by accident. Time, plague, and neglect turned it into a ruin. But the next island was made forbidden on purpose by a government that weaponized it and then walked away for almost 50 years. In 1942, the British War Office secretly seized Gruinard Island, an uninhabited patch of land off the northwest coast of Scotland. Under a classified program called Operation Vegetarian, scientists from Porton Down, Britain's Biological Weapons Research Center, detonated experimental anthrax bombs over sheep tethered on the island. The goal was to prove that airborne anthrax spores could devastate enemy livestock and potentially starve Germany into submission. The sheep died rapidly. The experiment worked exactly as planned. And then the scientists left. But the anthrax didn't. Bacillus anthracus, the bacterium that causes anthrax, produces spores that are extraordinarily hardy. They can survive in soil for decades, resisting heat, cold, and chemical breakdown. Gruinard's soil was saturated with them, and no amount of waiting was going to make them disappear on their own. For locals along the Scottish coast, the island became known simply as the Island of Death. Warning signs were posted declaring the land dangerous and off-limits to all visitors. In 1962, BBC reporter Fife Robertson stood on the opposite shore, unable to land, calling it the Mystery Island, and for good reason. For almost 50 years, the British government's strategy was essentially to hope that time would solve the problem. It didn't. In the 1980s, a group of activists operating under the name Operation Dark Harvest forced the issue. They collected contaminated soil from Gruinard and threatened to spread it on the mainland unless the government took real action. That threat finally triggered a massive decontamination effort. Hundreds of tons of formaldehyde diluted with seawater were pumped into the soil over several years. In 1990, the British government officially declared Gruinard safe and removed the warning signs. But officially safe carries an asterisk. Even today, visitors who travel to the island often wear protective equipment, and scientists acknowledge that deeper soil layers may still harbor viable spores. Gruinard is a reminder that some experiments leave marks that outlast the people who ran them, and that a government's promise of safety doesn't always mean the danger is gone. Gruinard was quarantined because of what humans put there. But the next island is quarantined because of what humans might accidentally bring. On November 14, 1963, Icelandic fishermen watched something no living human had ever witnessed at such close range: a new island being born. Volcanic eruptions on the seafloor south of Iceland pushed molten rock above the surface of the North Atlantic, and over the next 3.5, that eruption built an entirely new landmass from nothing. They named it Surtsey, after the Norse fire giant Surtur, and by the time the eruptions ended in 1967, the island measured about 2.7 square kilometers. Iceland immediately recognized what it had: one of the rarest natural laboratories on Earth. Here was a completely sterile island, no plants, no insects, no bacteria in the soil, sitting in the open ocean, waiting to be colonized by life. Scientists could track in real time how ecosystems form from scratch. Every moss spore that arrived on the wind, every insect that drifted in on ocean currents, every bird that landed and left droppings that seeded new plant growth, all of it could be documented from the very beginning. That's why virtually no one is allowed to set foot on Surtsey. Not because of volcanic danger, though the lava cliffs and brutal North Atlantic weather make it physically hostile. The real barrier is scientific purity. The island itself is the experiment, and every unauthorized human visit risks contaminating the data. Even dropping a peanut shell, tracking in a seed caught on a bootlace, or leaving behind a scrap of organic material could introduce species that weren't supposed to arrive yet, skewing decades of carefully collected ecological records. Only a handful of researchers receive permits each year, and they follow strict decontamination protocols before stepping onto the island. Surtsey is the curiosity loop from the beginning of this video, the most tightly guarded island on this list, forbidden not because it could hurt you, but because you could hurt it. You might expect the world's forbidden islands to be in war zones, polar regions, or the middle of the Pacific. But there's one just 28 miles from the Golden Gate Bridge. The Farallon Islands sit off the coast of San Francisco, visible on clear days from the California shoreline. They became a national wildlife refuge in 1909, and in 1974, Congress designated most of the land as the Farallon Wilderness, one of the only wilderness areas in the United States that is entirely closed to public access. Wilderness here doesn't mean tread lightly and pack out your trash. It means nobody comes in, period. A handful of researchers live periodically on southeast Farallon Island, studying one of the richest marine ecosystems on the west coast. The surrounding waters teem with seals, sea lions, and humpback whales, along with a significant population of great white sharks that patrol the area during seal season. Boating incidents from shark encounters in the surrounding waters aren't hypothetical. They've been documented multiple times. Even approaching the islands by sea carries real risk, and landing without authorization is a federal offense. The Farallons are a reminder that forbidden doesn't always mean far away. Sometimes it's practically in your own backyard, hidden behind fog and cold Pacific swells. The Farallons are close to civilization but off limits. The next island is so far from civilization that getting permission is the easy part. Surviving the journey is the hard part. Heard Island sits roughly 2/3 of the way from Madagascar to Antarctica, deep in the southern Indian Ocean. It is one of the most remote islands on Earth, dominated by glaciers and an active volcano called Mawson Peak that rises to 2,745 meters, taller than anything in the Australian Alps. Mawson Peak is one of the only volcanically active summits in the sub-Antarctic, and yet almost no human beings ever see its smoking crater except through the windows of passing research ships. Australia claimed Heard Island in 1947 and placed it under strict environmental protection. A 1987 ordinance requires a formal permit just to enter the territory or its surrounding 12 nautical mile sea zone. Its World Heritage status emphasizes keeping the island at zero permanent human footprint. Getting a permit is possible but rare, and the logistics of actually reaching the island are staggering. Expeditions require polar-grade vessels, satellite communications, self-sufficient supplies for weeks, and rigorous environmental protocols to ensure nothing is introduced to the ecosystem. A badly timed landing attempt in the Southern Ocean's violent seas means being stranded far beyond any rescue response, potentially for days or weeks. Heard Island is the kind of place where the planet itself seems to be telling you to stay away. Active lava, glacial cliffs, hurricane-force winds, and enough distance from the nearest search and rescue team to make any emergency potentially fatal. It's not forbidden because of politics or history. It's forbidden because the Earth built it that way. Every island so far was forbidden because of nature, contamination, or science, but the last two are forbidden because of something worse: governments. Decided the people who lived there simply didn't matter. Diego Garcia is a coral atoll in the Chagos archipelago, deep in the Indian Ocean. For generations, a community of Chagosian islanders lived there, fishing, farming coconuts, and raising families on one of the most remote but livable islands in the tropics. That changed in the 1960s and 70s, when the United Kingdom forcibly removed every resident so that the US and UK could build a joint military base. The Chagosians were loaded onto ships, transported to Mauritius and the Seychelles, and told they could never return. Since then, Diego Garcia has been one of the most restricted places on Earth. There are no commercial flights, no civilian sea access, and permits are effectively limited to military personnel and contractors. Even journalists have struggled to get temporary access. A BBC team covering a legal challenge to the base's existence had to fight through layers of UK and US government objections just to set foot on the atoll. Those who have made it describe a surreal contrast: lush greenery, immaculate white sand beaches, turquoise water stretching to the horizon, all sitting alongside gray military aircraft and streets named Churchill Road. The Chagosians have fought for decades in international courts and diplomatic forums for the right to return home. Recent reporting has focused on sovereignty negotiations between the UK and Mauritius, but none of those discussions center on reopening the island to its original inhabitants. Diego Garcia exists today mainly as a name on maps and in court documents, a paradise converted into a military installation, and a community scattered across oceans with no clear path back. Diego Garcia's residents were removed and promised they could come back. The same promise was made to the people of Bikini Atoll. Except at Bikini, the government didn't just take the island, they erased parts of it from existence. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States conducted 23 nuclear weapons tests on Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. The largest of them, Castle Bravo, detonated on March 1, 1954, with a yield of 15 megatons, roughly 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The fireball alone stretched nearly 5 miles across. The blast vaporized 3 of the atoll's 23 islands. They didn't sink or erode. They stopped existing as land. Where solid ground once held coconut palms and homes, there was nothing left but open water and irradiated coral rubble. Before the tests began, the US military had relocated the Marshallese community living on the atoll, assuring them the move was temporary and that they'd be allowed to return once the tests were complete. That promise was broken almost immediately. The nuclear blasts didn't just destroy islands, they shredded reefs, contaminated lagoon sediments with long-lived radionuclides like cesium-137 and strontium-90, and poisoned the soil so thoroughly that growing food there became dangerous. The displaced Bikinians and nearby atoll communities suffered elevated rates of thyroid cancer, birth defects, and other radiation-related illnesses from fallout exposure that drifted far beyond the test zone. Decades later, the contamination persists. Radiation surveys conducted as recently as 2016 found levels on some islands still exceeding long-term habitation guidelines. A 1997 advisory group concluded that you could walk on the islands safely for short visits, but living there and eating locally grown food would deliver unacceptable radiation doses over time. 80 years after the first test, the promise of return remains broken. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Limited dive tourism is now allowed at Bikini Atoll under tightly controlled conditions. Beneath the lagoon's impossibly blue water sits a fleet of warships that the US military positioned as test targets during the nuclear blasts. Battleships, aircraft carriers, and submarines resting upright on the lagoon floor, slowly being consumed by coral. Divers descend into one of the most surreal underwater landscapes on Earth, swimming through the corridors of vessels that witnessed nuclear detonations, surrounded by marine life that has quietly reclaimed a radioactive graveyard. It is one of the most haunting dive sites in the world, a nuclear battlefield transformed into an underwater museum that no one ever planned to build. 8 islands, 8 completely different reasons you're not allowed to set foot on them. Lethal wildlife evolved to kill on contact. Persistent biological contamination left behind by a government experiment. A fragile scientific study that a single seed could ruin. Crumbling infrastructure soaked in centuries of plague. Military secrecy that displaced an entire community. And nuclear fallout that vaporized the land itself. But together, they reveal something about the relationship between humans and the places we're not supposed to go. Some of these islands kicked us out. Some we poisoned beyond repair. Some we protect by staying away. And some were taken from the people who called them home. The thread connecting all of them is simple. On a planet of 8 billion people, there are still places where human presence is either impossible, illegal, or both. And every single one of them has a story about why. If you want more, check out one of the videos on screen right now. Like the video, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.